We are delighted to have Brother Bennett here this morning. Richard E. Bennett was born and raised in Sudbury, Ontario, Canada. He received his BA in English Literature from BYU, his MA in American History from BYU, and his PhD from Wayne State University in American Intellectual History. He is currently the chair of the Department of Church History and Doctrine, Religious Education, after serving as an Associate Dean of Religious Education from 2010 to 2013. He has received numerous awards and honors, the most recent being elected president of the Mormon History Association in 2013. He has authored numerous books, articles, and book chapters. He is married to Patricia Dyer, and together they have 5 children and 20 grandchildren.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? From time to time, you write an article that you think you can put to bed, but it just doesn't want to go to bed. It just wants to continue to grow. And this particular study that I'm going to make today, I gave as a speech here at BYU, a devotional, and I thought it was all finished, but my wife and I continue to do research back east and in England, and more just keeps coming up on this thing. So I hope you'll be okay with my revealing a few things which we haven't talked about before. If it sounds repetitive, you'll find that some parts of this are new, and I'll try to signal what those are. The full title of this presentation, brothers and sisters and friends, is Martin Harris's 1828 visit to Luther Bradish, Charles Anthon, and Samuel Mitchill. Few episodes in early Mormon history are as fascinating and problematic as the February 1828 visit of Martin Harris to Professor Charles Anthon of Columbia College in New York City. Scholars from both within and without the church, those seeking corroboration for the translation of the Book of Mormon, as well as those trying to debunk the authenticity of the entire story, continue to grapple with the details of this event and its several implications. The purpose of my presentation this morning is to shed light on this old story, to proffer new dimensions and interpretations on the trip's origin, to take a fresh look at Charles Anthon's credentials and what he may have said to Harris, and to show whom Harris consulted with and what confirmation they actually provided. While there are details we do not yet fully know, it is clear that Martin Harris returned from his trip east, confirmed in his desire to assist in the translation and printing of the Book of Mormon, although perhaps for additional reasons than we have long supposed. The outlines of this story are well known in Mormon history. Working with the gold plates, Joseph Smith began the work of early translating in late 1827 from the Reformed Egyptian language found on Mormon's abridgment of the large plates of Nephi. Early on, he transcribed some of the characters from the plates as a sort of alphabet or reference guide. His primary scribe was Martin Harris, a respected Palmyra farmer, an early and keen supporter of Smith's work, who later became one of the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon. For a variety of reasons, Harris begged leave to take a transcription of the characters Joseph Smith had come across in his translation attempts to New York City. As historian B.H. Roberts writes, quote, to submit them to men of learning for their inspection, quote. Roberts says Harris submitted, quote, 2 papers containing different transcripts to Professors Anthon and Mitchill of New York, one that was translated and one not translated. Quote, according to Anthon's own accounts, Harris sought out Mitchill first, who then wrote a letter referring him to Anthon. Harris later recounted that Anthon, quote, stated that the translation was correct, more so than any he had before seen translated from the Egyptian, and after viewing the characters, said that they were Egyptian, Chaldaic, Assyric, and Arabic. And he said that they were true characters, and that the translation of such of them that had been translated was correct. He even wrote a note certifying to the people of Palmyra that they were true characters. However, upon hearing Harris say in answer to his question that an angel of God had revealed such things, and that part of the plates were sealed, Anthon promptly tore up his certificate. Denying the possibility of angels and of all such heavenly manifestations, he asked Harris to bring the plates for him to translate. And when Harris replied he could not do so, and that parts of the plates were sealed, the man from Columbia brusquely responded, I cannot read a sealed book. Harris then returned to Mitchill, quote, who sanctioned what Professor Anthon had said, both respecting the characters and the translation, quote. Unfortunately, Harris did not indicate how Mitchill would have been able to corroborate Anthon's response, or even who this Mitchill was. Sometime later, perhaps after reporting back to Joseph Smith, this entire episode with Anthon came to be interpreted as a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, that of the words of a book that is sealed, which men deliver to one that is learned, saying, read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I cannot, for it is sealed. Isaiah 29, verse 11. Thus, in spite of the limited ability of Anthon and Mitchill to pronounce judgment on the Book of Mormon transcription, and despite the ridicule from Anthon regarding the story of angels and the destruction of Anthon's certificate, Harris was sufficiently convinced to go into debt and devote his full time to the support of the young Palmyra prophet. Whatever Harris gleaned from these leading scholars, if he left Palmyra wondering and inquiring, he returned home supporting and defending the translation of the Book of Mormon. Just who this Professor Mitchill was and what he actually said to Harris is no longer unknown, nor is it a mere footnote in our history, and this morning will constitute a major focus of this paper. Now, many have presumed that Martin Harris went east primarily because he wanted scholarly validation or independent corroboration of the translation efforts of young Joseph Smith, who had very little formal education. Such a reason makes sense, particularly if he would be asked to help finance the publication of the final product. However, there may have been other reasons for Harris to seek insights from scholars. According to Joseph Smith's earliest 1832 history, Martin Harris had received his own independent, corroborative inspiration even before making the trip, as a result of his giving Joseph $50 to move from Manchester, New York to Harmony, Pennsylvania. quote, "And because of his faith and this righteous deed, the Lord appeared unto him in a vision, and showed unto him his marvelous work which he was about to do. And he immediately came to Susquehanna and said the Lord had shown him that he must go to New York City with some of the characters. So we proceeded to copy some of them, and he took his journey to the eastern cities." Now, brothers and sisters, I hope you note that. According to Joseph Smith's own account, that Martin Harris had a special experience with the divine before he went on this trip. Perhaps then, there was as much compliance as there was corroboration involved in Harris making the trip to New York in 1828. The next quote is from Lucy Mack Smith, one of our very few sources for this early time in church history. Lucy Mack Smith's account makes provision for precisely what kind of expertise Harris should seek after. And let's quote, "It was agreed upon that Martin Harris should follow him as soon as Joseph should have sufficient time to transcribe some of the Egyptian characters, and then Harris was to take the characters to the east and through the country in every direction. And on his way, he was to call on all who were professed linguists to give them an opportunity of showing their talents in giving a translation of the characters." I just want to emphasize that it wasn't just to go to one person, and they were going to scatter all over in his trip to the east. Now, much has been written about the so-called Anthon Transcript, which Harris took with him to New York. Who authored it? What types of characters it represented? If it constituted an actual translation? And if so, what it may have said. Until recently, the prevailing notion was that this document, now housed in the archives of the Community of Christ in Independence, Missouri, was the actual piece of paper that Harris showed to Anthon and others in New York City in 1828. By the way, I show this to my students sometimes, and they get quite a kick out of it. Can you hear me? There are birthday cakes on here. There are all kinds of different transcriptions, different things that are on here. We have a lot of fun in our classes trying to transcribe what this might be. Now, B.H. Roberts has argued that at best, B.H. Roberts is, as you well know, for so long the leading Latter-day Saint scholar in the early 20th century. B.H. Roberts has argued that at best, the Community of Christ manuscript, containing only 7 horizontal lines, was a fragment of what was submitted to Anthon and Mitchill, and certainly not a translation manuscript in the true sense of the word. Other accounts speak of parallel columns and a second transcription bearing a translation. According to Charles Anthon himself, and we found new letters in the last little few years from Charles Anthon, the document which he said he saw showed letters in, quote, perpendicular columns in the Chinese mode of writing, not this, which indicates vertical, not horizontal columns. He also, Anthon, remembered, quote, that the whole ended in a rude representation of the Mexican zodiac. Quite sure that is a Mexican zodiac. If Anthon's memory is correct, it is virtually impossible to argue with certainty that the transcription, or that the Anthon transcript, is the only one he saw. Now, some have strenuously tried to debunk it as a hoax, while others have made a painstaking comparison of the characters written on the one transcript that has survived. You might find this interesting. Writing over 60 years ago, Ariel L. Crowley wrote a 3-part series of articles in the Improvement era in which he offered a surprisingly candid and somewhat convincing argument based on a comparison of these characters that you see, that they showed strong parallels to the hieratic or demotic forms of a later Egyptian cursive language. Several Book of Mormon apologists since that time, in what critics have dismissed as parallelomania, have tried to show similarities of the writings to Meroitic and other forms of Reformed Egyptian. Some have even compared them to Native American writings and have tried to translate them as part of the Jaredite exodus to the New World, as recounted in the Book of Mormon. A recent research stemming from the Joseph Smith Papers Project fairly well shows that based on handwriting analysis, the Anthon transcript described above was likely not written by Joseph in 1828, but by John Whitmer in 1829, and therefore could not have been the one displayed in New York City. In all likelihood, it was a copy of an earlier facsimile, likely derived from one of the documents that Joseph Smith created in the winter of 27 and 1828. And I'd like to thank Garrett Dirkmatt and Mike McKay for their fine work on these topics. Now, Lucy Mack Smith says in her account, as we mentioned earlier, that Harris was to seek out linguists in every direction. Recall that. 3 of his contemporaries make it clear that he first stopped off at Albany, the capital city of the Empire State, before proceeding down the Hudson River to New York City. William W. Phelps said that Harris went to New York City by way of Utica and Albany. Pomeroy Tucker, who had sold his Wayne Sentinel newspaper and his printing operation to E.B. Grandin in 1827, remembered that Harris sought the interpretation and bibliographical scrutiny of such scholars as Honorable Luther Bradish, a Dr. Mitchill, Professor Anthon, and others. John H. Gilbert, Jr., typesetter of the Book of Mormon in E.B. Grandin's Palmyra print shop, remembered many years later that Harris stopped at Albany and called on Lieutenant Governor Bradish. With what success, I do not know, I'm quoting. He proceeded to New York and called on Professor Anthon. Now, why Harris chose to see Bradish is a topic of remarkable interest. Suffice it to say that the Bradish and Harris families had been well-established citizens of Palmyra for many years, that the two men therefore knew each other, that Bradish had become a very successful Wall Street lawyer and New York State Assemblyman by this time, and that he was a man of means and influence and in a position to possibly assist in the costs of printing the Book of Mormon. Let me just add something in here. Bradish, who later became Lieutenant Governor of the state of New York, his wife died in 1819 in childbirth. The child died. Bradish is devastated. Not knowing what to do, he gets an email from John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State. Adams says to Bradish, would you fulfill a great mission for the United States government? And Bradish says, well, what would you like me to do? And he said, would you take a secret mission to Constantinople? And so Bradish agrees, and in 1819 leaves on a special ship, crosses over, gets to Constantinople, meets with the Sultan there in Constantinople, and receives permission, of all things, to be the Indiana Jones for the United States government in Egypt. And so he gets on another secret ship, and he goes to Egypt, and he's in Egypt during the War of the Consuls. If you may remember this, where the British and the French were excavating, that's probably too strong a term, were removing so many marvelous things from Egypt with the permission of the Egyptian government. And he's the only one, at the time, the only American in Egypt in 1820. Now, if someone comes to Brady saying, I have something like a reformed Egyptian document, and he's a friend, and he's from Palmyra, I can just imagine what the conversation's going to be about. Just a few little sidelines here. You all remember the story of the Rosetta Stone, that in 1798, the French had invaded Egypt to disrupt the British supply lines to India. That's under Napoleon had done that invasion. And long story short, the French forces discovered this thing near Cairo on a wall. And the French lieutenant who discovered it seems to think, this looks rather interesting. Interesting. You probably know the significance of this. The Rosetta Stone of 1798 took 24 years to be deciphered by the greatest linguist in the world, and that was Jean-Francois Champollion. Not Napoleon, Champollion, who knew 16 different languages, and his understanding of Coptic was the key to be able to decipher this magnificent, what would you call this thing? The key to understanding ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Everyone's abuzz about what's going on in Egypt in the 1820s. Champollion is still considered our man of Grenoble to be the greatest linguist of his age, if not ever. And our man, Bradish, was there in Egypt at the time. May I expand on something else? I haven't got my paper here. Something that I mentioned, I've been doing some new things. My wife and I have been over to the British Museum working there, and we have discovered more of this. We have discovered that Bradish very well knew Antonio Lobolo, who discovers the ancient scrolls and mummies from which the book of Abraham came. And we're following that up. Fascinating things. Furthermore, another reason why he may have gone to see Bradish. Bradish knew the printing business. And an encouraging word from him could open doors in many places. If you're looking for someone to help publish a book about the Indians, he couldn't have gone to one better position than Luther Bradish. For instance, we now know that Bradish not only knew the Grandin family well back in Palmyra, who printed the Book of Mormon, but he was also literary agent for James Fenimore Cooper, the author of Pioneer, Leatherstocking, and other wilderness novels, then coming into such rich popularity. And you well know that American novels really began at this time. Before that time, we kind of relied on Sir Walter Scott and all the British authors. It's in the 1820s that American literature really begins to come to the fore, and it's these two men. And Bradish is the agent for both. Consequently, Bradish knew Isaac Carey and Isaac Lee, the best-known Philadelphia book publishers. And he was in the ideal position to help Harris with the publication of any fine American manuscript, particularly one that might speak about Native American Indians. If Harris was looking for someone who could open doors for him in New York and in Philadelphia, one who might help him either with financing the printing of the book or finding publishers for it, Bradish was the perfect man to see. The two men likely met in Albany that February of 1828, since the legislature was then in session. You remember that Bradish was also a New York assemblyman. It's reasonable to conclude that they talked about Palmyra, Grandin, Joseph Smith, and the work of translation, Egypt, Champollion, and other topics. I've concluded that very likely Harris showed him the characters which Joseph Smith had transcribed. The precise nature of their conversation awaits discovery. But there is no indication that Bradish pledged any kind of financial support. An astute lawyer, politician, and businessman, Bradish had many friends in Palmyra. Supporting Harris in a financially uncertain, highly debatable publishing enterprise as the Book of Mormon might lose him credibility and support, especially when others in Palmyra were then also asking for his financial support. Instead, Bradish likely recommended, since he knew the city well, that once in New York City, Harris visit with the leading naturalist in the country, Professor Samuel L. Mitchill. A Quaker from birth who was rather short and inclining to corpulency, full-faced with a double chin and a pleasant, open countenance. This man, Mitchill, in 1828, at age 64, was regarded by presidents and paupers, farmers and fishermen as one of America's greatest minds and scholars. A man of the many and a friend of every class, he possessed a voracious curiosity and a taste for new discoveries. His door was always open, for he delighted to learn from everyone, no matter what their station in life. Mitchill was well known for his what's called the Mitchillian cabinet of specimens of plants, seeds, animals, hieroglyphs, facsimiles from all over the world. His scientific interests knew no bounds. John Randolph called him a chaos of knowledge, just like my faculty. And Felix Pascali described him, quote, as an umpire of all merits, inventions, discoveries, projects, arts, and sciences. He was known among his colleagues as the Nestor of American science, a stalking library, and the Delphic Oracle of New York. Even President Thomas Jefferson, himself a naturalist and a scientist, you remember that, referred to this man in the following terms: the Congressional Dictionary. Greatly admiring him for his knowledge of the natural sciences. By the way, Mitchill goes on to serve as United States Senator for the state of New York, was with Jefferson in his administration, and had a great deal to do with the beginning of the Lewis and Clark expeditions. Many of Lewis and Clark's flora and fauna Jefferson turned over to Mitchill for identification, cataloging, and classification. However, before offering his learned opinion on the written characters which Harris brought with him, Mitchill kindly referred him to his colleague, the young and upcoming scholar of linguistics, the 31-year-old Professor Charles Anthon, A.B., LL.D. Born in New York City, Anthon began his study of Greek and Latin at Columbia when only 14 years of age. At age 23, he took up a position of professor of languages at Columbia, formerly King's College before the Revolutionary War. His famous edition of Lempriere's Classical Dictionary, first published in 1825, had already marked Anthon as a rising classical scholar. However, in 1828, he was but an adjunct professor of Greek and Latin, more an accomplished grammarian than he was a prestigious scholar. His first love was the classics, especially the works of Homer and Herodotus. While he knew Greek, Latin, German, and French superbly well, there's little indication he knew much about Egyptian, Hebrew, or any other Middle Eastern language. Because of his love of languages, he was probably aware of emerging research interests in Egyptian hieroglyphics and of the recent decodings of the ancient Egyptian writings on the Rosetta Stone by Champollion. And while it is reasonable to conclude that he may have been interested in ancient Near Eastern languages, Anthon was by no means a scholar of such. By force of his own brusque personality, he claimed to know more in this area than he really did. Just a word about Anthon. Went on for quite a reputation in his career. He was a confirmed bachelor his entire life, quite a large man, and a very demanding grammarian. Poor and pity the young students that came to his class without knowing their declensions and vocabulary well. In fact, the students called him, shall I say this, Old Bull. Scared stiff of this man. I can understand why when Martin Harris went to see him, it would have been not the most fascinating conversation in the world. Let's go back to this man. Unlike his junior colleague, Mitchill had been studying the origins of the American. When Anthon showed Harris the door, Mitchill welcomed him back and sanctioned what Harris showed him for at least two reasons. Like Anthon, Mitchill was a linguist, having studied the Oriental languages, the classical languages of Greek and Latin, and was a student of many American Indian languages, hieroglyphs, and native dialects, and he was the best student of Champollion and Champollion's work on the Rosetta Stone, in America. One of the founders of the American Philosophical Society, which, as you may recall, at that time was the center for studying Native American languages. Mitchill had been studying the origins of the American Indian people for several years and had painstakingly developed his own two races theory of ancient America. His interest in the history of the ancient American Indian was therefore at a peak when Harris showed him this transcript. Mitchill had, in fact, arrived at the conclusion as early as 1808 and had been expanding upon it for 20 years before Harris arrived on his doorstep. Arrived at the conclusion that three races of Malays, Tartars, and Scandinavians contributed to make up the ancient American population. He believed that the Tartars, as he called the originating stock, were primarily from northeastern Russia and China. He also had concluded that another great race of people, had once co-inhabited ancient America, what he called a more delicate white race, which he believed originated in the Polynesian islands of the South Pacific. By the way, he came to these conclusions by going all over the eastern United States in caves and in byways and in shorelines and picking up everything that he could, especially studying textiles and pottery. He had spent years coming to this conclusion. These people, these more delicate folks, he called the Australasians, or Malays. They were, however, eventually overtaken and exterminated by the more savage, warlike Tartars, or Eastern Asiatics to the north, came over the Bering Strait, the ancestors of many of the North American Indians, and had long ago become extinct. By the way, I should mention, I don't someplace here, that Mitchill was adopted into so many American Indian tribes. He knew their languages. He had studied with them. He was a great supporter of the American Indian. Adopted into so many of, especially of the 5-nation Indian tribes, 6-nation Indian tribes. Iroquois, Mohawk, Seneca, you name it. So Mitchill had come to the conclusion what has become of them, that more delicate race. They have probably been overcome by the more warlike and ferocious hordes that entered our hemisphere from the northeast of Asia. These Tartars of the higher latitudes have issued from the great hive of nations and desolated in the course of their migrations the southern tribes of America as they have done to those of Asia and Europe. The greater part of the North American natives are of the Tartar stock, the descendants of the hardy warriors who destroyed the weaker Malays that had preceded them. Mitchill maintained that the Iroquois Indians were of Tartar descent who expelled or destroyed the former possessors of the fertile tracts, reaching from Lake Ontario southwestwardly to the River Ohio. He went on to argue, not everybody accepted his argument, but that's beside the point. He went on to argue that there must have been a series of great last battles in the state of New York, in upstate New York. He'd combed the state so many times, long before the building of the Erie Canal. In fact, he's one of the fathers of the Erie Canal. He and Governor DeWitt Clinton. DeWitt Clinton was a student of our man, Mitchill. When they were building the Erie Canal, the idea was don't interfere too much of where the Indians may have been. Don't try to destroy too many of those places. He was a very careful advisor in the building of the Erie Canal. But he goes on to this point. He argued that the great last battles between these warring peoples occurred in upstate New York. And as you can see from the map, a few miles southeast of Rochester, not far from Harris's Palmyra home. What other hill is around there? I hope you're following that. It was probably for these and other reasons, and there were other reasons, we can't go into it today because our time is limited, that Mitchill showed deep interest in the transcript of the characters Harris showed him. Whether or not he wrote anything to substantiate the veracity of the characters is yet unknown. The veracity of the characters. However, we now know what the two men said to each other. According to the 1831 Journal of a New York newspaper reporter, James Gordon Bennett, this is probably arguably the earliest account of Harris's visit to New York. He, Harris, carried the engravings from the plates to New York, showed them Professor Anthon, who said he did not know what language they were, and that makes sense, considering what we now understand of Anthon's understanding of language, those particular languages. He did not know what language they were. Told him to carry them to Dr. Mitchill. Mitchill examined them, compared them with other hieroglyphs which he had, thought them very curious, said they were the characters of a nation now extinct, which he named. Another account of the same thing, I discovered these accounts in New York City. This is from Dr. Mitchell's Gordon Bennett's published account. He said, they attempted to get the book printed but could not raise the means till Harris stepped forward and raised money on his farm for that purpose. Harris, with several manuscripts in his pocket, and that makes sense, went to the city of New York and called upon one of the professors of Columbia College for the purpose of showing them to him. Harris says that the professors thought them very curious, but admitted that he could not decipher them. Said he to Harris, Harris, you had better go to the celebrated Dr. Mitchill and show them to him. He is very learned in these ancient languages, and I have no doubt will be able to give you some satisfaction. Well, where does he live? Asked Harris. He was told, and off he posted with the engravings from the golden plates to submit to Dr. Mitchill. Harris says that the doctor received him very politely. That fits the kind of character that Mitchill was. Looked at the engravings, made a learned dissertation on them, compared them with the hieroglyphics discovered by Champollion in Egypt. And then he set them down as a language of a people formerly in existence in the East, but now no more. Anthon's statement of not being able to read a sealed book gained traction and circulation among Mormon missionaries in the very early days of the church. Furthermore, church leaders and scholars have referred to Anthon's words many times since. Most notably, LeGrand Richards in his best-selling A Marvelous Work and a Wonder, a primer on the restoration for millions of investigators to Mormonism, boldly declared that when Anthon said, "I cannot read a seal book," he did not realize that he was literally fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah. In addition to the exchange with Anthon, however, those interested in the coming forth of the Book of Mormon should recognize that there was much more to the story. It was likely Professor Samuel Latham Mitchill, thanks to the recommendation of both Luther Bradish and Charles Anthon himself, who gave the most scholarly corroboration Harris was looking for that winter of 1828. Returning home to Palmyra with the story of prophecy fulfilled on the one hand, and on the other, the sanctioning of all that Anthon may have said by America's foremost naturalist, Harris was ready to provide the financial means to publish the Book of Mormon. My brothers and sisters, I conclude with my testimony in these things. I believe that the Lord is continuing to open new things to our understanding, new insights, line upon line, here and there, a little. I believe that we will continue to learn more that will corroborate the coming forth, the translation, and the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon, and it's exciting to be part of that. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.